Gavin Crawford's sneakers skidded against wet cobblestones as he burst through the evening crowd outside Dominic's restaurant, his 8-year-old voice cracking with terror as he screamed words that made every head turn. "Don't get in your cars!" The boy's chest heaved, his school backpack bouncing against his spine as he ran toward the 4 black SUVs parked in perfect formation along Savannah's historic waterfront. September humidity hung thick in the air, mixing with the scent of jasmine and something darker, Gavin's own fear sweat that had nothing to do with Georgia heat. Chase Holloway emerged from the restaurant's entrance, 6 feet of lethal elegance in a charcoal suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent. His reputation preceded him like a cold front. The man who'd consolidated Savannah's underworld before his 30th birthday, who'd turned his father's brutal empire into something more sophisticated, but no less dangerous. Every conversation in the vicinity died as his ice-blue eyes locked onto the child racing toward his security detail, with the kind of desperation that made Chase's hand instinctively move toward the weapon beneath his jacket. The boy didn't slow down, despite 4 armed men stepping into formation, their bodies creating a human wall between Chase and whatever threat this child represented. Gavin's voice rose higher, more frantic, as he tried to push past security. "There's bombs! Under all of them! I saw the men. They weren't real maintenance workers." His words tumbled out in gasping fragments, terror making him stumble over consonants as tears streaked his dirt-smudged face. Chase raised one hand, a gesture that froze his men mid-motion, their training overridden by a command they'd learned never to question. He studied the boy with the same calculating intensity he applied to business negotiations and territorial disputes, noting details that others might miss. The sketchbook clutched in white-knuckled hands, the grass stains on knees suggesting he'd been lying on the ground watching, the specific panic in eyes that had seen something genuinely horrifying. This wasn't a prank or a setup. This child believed every word coming from his mouth. "What's your name?" Chase's voice was unexpectedly gentle, a tone his associates rarely heard as he crouched to the boy's eye level despite the expensive suit. His security team exchanged glances, their unease palpable. Protocol dictated they move their boss away from potential threats, not toward crying children with wild stories. But Chase had survived this long by trusting instincts that whispered louder than training, and right now those instincts were screaming that this terrified child had just saved his life. Gavin wiped his nose with the back of his hand, trying to steady his breathing enough to speak clearly. "Gavin Crawford, sir. I was sketching the fountain for my art project when I saw them." His finger pointed toward the SUVs with a trembling accuracy that made Chase's blood run cold. 2 men in gray coveralls with city maintenance patches, but the patches were wrong. The logo was backwards and they moved too fast, like they were scared someone would notice them. Chase's head of security, a former Marine named Bishop, was already moving before the words finished leaving Gavin's mouth. The man spoke rapid commands into his radio, summoning their explosives expert while simultaneously blocking civilian access to the vehicles. Chase watched his organization shift into crisis mode with practiced efficiency, but his attention remained fixed on the boy who was now shaking so violently, his teeth chattered despite the evening warmth. "How long ago?" Chase's question was sharp, professional, already calculating timelines and escape routes if this situation went from bad to catastrophic. Gavin's eyes darted to the old church clock visible above the restaurant's roof, his young mind struggling to translate observation into useful information. "Maybe an hour? I had to finish my drawing first, and then I ran all the way here. But my legs aren't very long, so it took a while." The admission hit Chase like a physical blow. This child had seen trained operatives planting what were likely vehicle-borne explosives, and his first instinct hadn't been to run home to safety. Instead, he'd stayed long enough to complete an art assignment before racing into danger to warn strangers. The peculiar courage of that choice suggested either remarkable stupidity or something far more complicated, something that made Chase's mind reach for memories he'd buried years ago. Bishop's voice crackled through the comm unit, confirmation that made every muscle in Chase's body tense. 4 devices, professionally installed, remote detonation capability. "We're looking at complete elimination of anyone within 15 feet of these vehicles." The words were delivered with military precision, but Chase heard the underlying message. Without Gavin's warning, he and his 3 top lieutenants would have been reduced to unidentifiable remains scattered across Savannah's historic district. Chase stood, his hand briefly touching Gavin's shoulder in a gesture that surprised even himself. The boy flinched at the contact, then seemed to relax fractionally when Chase's expression remained calm, despite the chaos erupting around them. Bomb disposal specialists were arriving in unmarked vehicles, Police sirens wailed in the distance, and Chase's mind was already racing through the list of enemies bold enough and stupid enough to attempt something this spectacular. "You did good, Gavin." Chase's words were quiet enough that only the boy could hear them, a private acknowledgement in the growing circus of emergency response. Gavin's eyes widened, surprise replacing fear for just a moment. Adults rarely spoke to him with that kind of respect, that suggestion he'd done something genuinely important. His mother always said he asked too many questions, noticed too many things, got himself into situations other kids avoided. The sketchbook slipped from Gavin's loosening grip, falling open to a page covered in precise pencil drawings of the fountain, the surrounding buildings, and, Chase's breath caught, 2 figures rendered in careful detail working beneath a vehicle. The boy had documented everything with an artist's attention to observable reality, creating evidence more valuable than any security camera footage. Each line was deliberate, showing the men's postures, their tool bags, even the slight bulge of concealed weapons beneath their coveralls. Chase picked up the sketchbook with careful reverence, studying details that confirmed this child possessed an unusual gift for observation. The backwards patch Gavin mentioned was clearly visible in the drawing, along with facial features rendered with enough accuracy to potentially identify the perpetrators. This wasn't just luck or coincidence. This was a specific kind of intelligence that reminded Chase of someone he'd tried very hard to forget. Gavin Crawford. Chase repeated the name slowly, testing it against memory and finding the connection that made his chest tighten with recognition. Crawford wasn't a common name in Savannah's circles, and there was only one Crawford who'd intersected with Chase's world in a way that mattered. The boy's eyes, that unusual gray-green shade, confirmed what Chase's instincts had already whispered the moment Gavin spoke. Before Chase could process the implications, a battered Honda Civic screeched to a halt behind the police barricade, and a woman emerged with the kind of panic that transformed maternal instinct into something fierce and primal. She was wearing nurse's scrubs decorated with cartoon characters, her hair escaping from a messy ponytail, her face showing the exhaustion of someone who'd worked too many consecutive shifts. "Gavin!" Her voice carried across the chaos, and the boy's head whipped around with relief that suggested he'd been holding terror at bay through sheer willpower. Chase watched mother and son collide in an embrace that made something uncomfortable twist in his chest, the raw authenticity of love unfiltered by calculation or advantage. The woman was pulling Gavin back toward her car, already moving to extract them from a situation that screamed danger, her body positioned between her son and the armed men surrounding the SUVs. She hadn't looked at Chase yet, hadn't recognized that the center of this crisis was the man her son had just saved. Lainey Crawford's hands trembled as she performed a frantic visual assessment of her son, checking for injuries with practiced efficiency that came from years of nursing and single motherhood. Her questions tumbled out in rapid succession. Was he hurt? What happened? Why was he near the waterfront when he should have been at the library? Each one underscored by the barely controlled terror of a parent who'd received a call from Savannah PD, saying her child was at an active bomb scene. She hadn't heard the details, hadn't processed anything beyond your son and explosive devices, before grabbing her keys and abandoning her shift mid-round. Chase moved closer with deliberate steps, his presence commanding enough that Lainey's maternal focus finally shifted to register the dangerous man approaching her child. Her body language transformed instantly, protective instinct overriding common sense, as she positioned Gavin behind her and faced Chase with the kind of desperate courage that came from having nothing left to lose. "Stay away from him." Her voice was steady, despite obvious fear, and Chase found himself respecting the steel beneath her exhaustion. "Mrs. Crawford." Chase's use of her name made Lainey's eyes narrow, suspicion and confusion warring across features that showed the toll of 15 years spent surviving rather than living. She was younger than Chase had initially assumed, probably not yet 35, but hardship had carved lines around her eyes and mouth that spoke of sacrifices most people couldn't imagine. "Your son just saved my life and potentially prevented a mass casualty event. I need 5 minutes to explain why that matters." Lainey's grip on Gavin tightened, her nurse's brain processing the scene with growing comprehension. The expensive suits, the military-grade security response, the way every man in the vicinity deferred to Chase with a respect that transcended mere employment. Recognition flickered across her face, the kind that came from living in Savannah long enough to know which names meant power and which meant danger. "You're Chase Holloway." It wasn't a question, and the way she said his name carried the weight of someone who'd trained herself to avoid men exactly like him. Chase nodded once, acknowledging the reputation that preceded him, while gesturing toward Dominic's entrance. 5 minutes, Mrs. Crawford. Inside, away from the officers who'll want statements, away from people who don't need to hear what I'm about to tell you. His tone left no room for argument, but somehow avoided outright command, walking the line between request and expectation with practiced ease. Bishop moved to clear a path, and Chase saw Laney calculating odds, measuring risks, trying to determine if refusing the most dangerous man in Georgia was more hazardous than accepting his invitation. "Mom, he was nice to me." Gavin's whisper was probably meant to be private, but Chase's hearing had been sharpened by years of surviving rooms where a missed word could mean death. The boy's assessment was devastating in its simplicity. Kindness from a stranger had become noteworthy enough to mention, suggesting Gavin's world contained too few people who treated him with basic decency. Laney's expression crumbled slightly at her son's words, and Chase recognized the moment her resistance broke. They moved through Dominic's as a strange procession, Chase leading, Laney and Gavin following close together, Bishop securing their perimeter with silent efficiency. The restaurant's owner, an old man named Sal, who'd served 3 generations of Holloways, directed them to the private room without being asked, understanding that some conversations required walls and closed doors. The space was simple but elegant, exposed brick and old photographs of Savannah's past creating atmosphere that felt removed from the modern crisis outside. Chase waited until Laney and Gavin were seated before taking his own chair, deliberately choosing distance that might feel less threatening. He watched Laney position herself between him and her son, that protective instinct never quite relaxing, even as her eyes showed curiosity about why Georgia's most notorious figure wanted to speak with her specifically. The resemblance between mother and son was striking now that Chase could observe them together. Same stubborn chin, same unusual eye color, same tendency to notice details others missed. 15 years ago, a police detective named Rico Crawford saved my life. Chase delivered the words without preamble, watching Laney's face drain of color, as the name she'd probably trained herself not to speak hit like a physical blow. Gavin looked between them with confusion, not yet understanding why his mother's breath had caught, or why tears were suddenly threatening to spill down her cheeks. The official story said he was corrupt, that he died during a botched deal he'd arranged with my father's organization. Laney's voice came out hoarse, damaged by years of believing a lie that had poisoned her son's childhood. They said Rico helped criminals, that he died because he was dirty. The words were automatic, rehearsed, the explanation she'd given Gavin every time he'd asked about the father who existed only in photographs and whispered rumors. Chase could see the hope and terror warring in her expression, hope that maybe the narrative she'd been fed was false, terror of reopening wounds that had barely scarred over. Chase pulled a slim folder from his jacket's inner pocket, documents he'd kept for years, because some debts demanded acknowledgement, even when the creditor was dead. Rico was deep undercover, so deep that only 3 people knew his real assignment: his captain, the FBI liaison, and me. He slid the folder across the table, watching Laney's shaking hands open it to reveal classified files that should have been destroyed. He was investigating corruption in the department, dirty cops selling protection to my father's enemies. He broke cover to save me because the setup was orchestrated by the same officers he'd been tracking. The photographs inside showed a younger Chase, barely 17, surrounded by men with weapons, while Rico Crawford shouted warnings that had arrived seconds before bullets flew. Laney's fingers traced the images with reverence, seeing her husband's face free of the shame she'd been told defined his final moments. Gavin leaned closer, hungry for any glimpse of the father he'd been taught to never mention, the ghost that haunted their apartment in questions he'd learned not to ask. The officers who set up that meeting killed Rico and framed him as punishment for getting too close to their operation. Chase's voice hardened, remembering that night. The chaos, the blood, Rico's body covering his until backup arrived and turned a rescue into a cover-up. My father used his resources to expose them eventually, but by then the official narrative was set. The department couldn't admit they'd killed their own without revealing the extent of corruption, so Rico's file remained tainted. Laney's tears fell silently, grief and rage and relief mixing into something that transformed her exhausted features. They gave me a flag and condolences and looked at me like I'd chosen wrong, like I should have known what kind of man I married. Her words broke on suppressed sobs, 15 years of judgment and isolation cracking open. Gavin grew up hearing whispers that his father was dirty, kids at school saying his dad was a criminal, teachers watching him like corruption was genetic. Chase felt that uncomfortable twist in his chest again, understanding now why Gavin's courage had seemed familiar. Rico died protecting someone he believed could change things, someone who represented a chance to break cycles of violence his investigation had exposed. The admission cost something to voice. Chase rarely acknowledged the burden of another person's sacrifice, the weight of living up to faith he hadn't asked for. Tonight, his son did exactly the same thing, showed the same instinct to run toward danger if it meant protecting others. Gavin's small voice cut through the heavy emotion saturating the room. My dad was a hero? The question was tentative, hardly daring to hope that the shame he'd carried might actually be honor misunderstood. Chase turned to face the boy directly, seeing Rico's determination reflected in features still soft with childhood. Your father was the bravest man I ever met. He gave up everything, his reputation, his life, his family's future, because he believed truth mattered more than safety. Lainey reached for Gavin, pulling him close as they both processed revelations that rewrote their understanding of the past 15 years. Chase gave them that moment, watching grief transform into something cleaner, witnessing shame lift like morning fog burning off the river. He'd expected satisfaction from finally delivering this truth, but instead felt only the ache of witnessing healing he'd denied them by keeping silent for so long. Why tell us now? Lainey's question was sharp, despite tears, her intelligence cutting through emotion to the practical question that mattered. Chase appreciated the resilience that let her function, even while processing life-altering information, the same strength that had kept her and Gavin surviving when easier paths might have beckoned. Why not 5 years ago, or 10, when it might have made Gavin's childhood different? Chase met her eyes without flinching, accepting the accusation beneath her words. Because I'm a coward who convinced myself that the past was better left buried, that protecting my own peace mattered more than your truth. The admission was unusual. Chase rarely apologized, rarely acknowledged failure, but Lainey deserved honesty after years of lies, and because tonight proves that silence was wrong. Gavin saved my life the same way Rico did, and this time I won't let that sacrifice exist in shadow. Bishop's interruption came with a sharp knock that conveyed urgency without actual panic, and Chase read volumes in the tension bracketing his security chief's mouth. The bomb disposal had revealed sophisticated military-grade explosives, the kind that required connections beyond standard criminal channels, and preliminary investigation suggested a signature that made Chase's blood run cold. Paolo Marchetti's organization had been circling Savannah's territory for months, probing defenses, testing resolve, building toward something that now had a clear shape. We've got bigger problems. Bishop's words were clipped, professional, but his eyes flicked toward Gavin with concern that made Chase's protective instincts flare. The disposal team found microcameras positioned to capture the aftermath. Whoever planted those devices wanted documentation, proof of death for their employer. The implications settled heavy in the room. People had been watching this location, which meant they'd seen a small boy racing toward the SUVs with warning written all over his posture. Lainey's sharp intake of breath told Chase she'd grasped the danger before he could soften it, her medical training making her adept at reading between lines. They saw Gavin. It wasn't a question, and the fear returning to her voice was different now. Not the immediate terror of bombs and police, but the cold dread of understanding they'd become witnesses to an organization that eliminated loose ends. Her hand found her son's shoulder, gripping with enough force that Gavin winced but didn't pull away. Chase's mind was already racing through scenarios, calculating odds and plotting strategies with the ruthless efficiency that had kept him alive in a business where sentiment was usually fatal. Marchetti wasn't subtle. His reputation had been built on spectacular violence that sent messages, on eliminations that terrified potential rivals into submission. A child witness would be seen as unacceptable risk, especially a child whose warning had foiled an expensive, carefully planned operation. You can't go home. The statement landed with finality that made Lainey's defenses surge back to full strength, maternal instinct overriding survival logic. We're not staying with you, if that's what you're suggesting. Her voice carried steel despite the tremor underneath, and Chase recognized the desperation of someone who'd fought too hard for independence to surrender it easily. We'll go somewhere else. Somewhere safe. Maybe my sister in Atlanta or... There is nowhere safe. Chase cut through her planning with brutal honesty that made Lainey's protest die unspoken. Marchetti has resources across the Southeast, connections in law enforcement, eyes everywhere that matter. You run to family. You paint targets on them too. He hated delivering this truth, hated watching hope drain from her features, but sugarcoating reality would only make the inevitable worse. You stay visible. You're vulnerable. You hide without proper protection. You're just prolonging the timeline until they find you. Gavin's voice was small, frightened in ways that 8-year-olds shouldn't understand. Are the bad men coming for us because I told? The guilt in his question made Chase's chest tighten. This child was already blaming himself for consequences that should never touch his world. Lainey pulled him closer, her own fear momentarily forgotten in the face of her son's distress, and Chase saw the exact moment she realized they had no good options. The bad men are coming because they're cowards who hurt people to feel powerful. Chase directed his words to Gavin, but meant them for Lainey too, establishing the moral framework that would govern what came next. You did exactly what you should have done, what your father would have done. Now it's my turn to make sure that doing the right thing doesn't destroy your life the way it destroyed his. Lainey studied Chase with new intensity, measuring the man behind the reputation, trying to determine if trusting George's most dangerous figure was actually less risky than facing Marchetti's organization alone. Chase held her gaze, letting her see whatever she needed to see, understanding that this decision wasn't really about trust. It was about choosing between terrible options and hoping you picked the one that left your child alive. What are you proposing? My estate has security that makes Fort Knox look casual. Chase laid out facts without embellishment, letting reality speak for itself. 30 acres on the river, surveillance that covers every approach, guards who've kept me breathing for a decade despite people far more dangerous than Marchetti trying otherwise. He paused, acknowledging the elephant neither of them had addressed. You and Gavin stay there until this threat is neutralized, until we've dealt with Marchetti in ways that ensure he never threatens anyone in this city again. The weight of what Chase was offering, and what accepting would mean, hung heavy between them. Lainey would be entering his world, placing herself and her son under the protection of someone whose business was built on violence, trusting a criminal to keep them safer than the law ever could. Chase watched her weigh impossible choices, saw the exact moment survival instinct overruled pride, and felt something uncomfortable lodge in his chest at her reluctant nod. How long? Lainey's question was practical, already mentally cataloging what they'd need, how she'd explain an extended absence from work, which lies she'd need to tell to maintain some semblance of normal life. Chase appreciated her pragmatism, even as he hated the answer he had to give, the truth that would upend whatever stability she'd managed to build from disaster. As long as it takes. Chase's words acknowledged that this wasn't a temporary inconvenience, but a fundamental shift in their circumstances, and he saw Lainey absorb that reality with visible effort. Marchetti won't stop until he's eliminated the threat he perceives, which means we don't get to choose our timeline. We get to choose whether we're prepared when he makes his move. Bishop was already making calls, mobilizing transport and security protocols for assets that now included a terrified woman and her 2 brave sons. Gavin's sketchbook still lay open on the table between them, his drawings bearing silent witness to the conversation that was reshaping 3 lives in ways none of them had anticipated hours earlier. Chase glanced at the careful renderings again, seeing not just evidence but testament to a child's particular way of seeing the world, the attention to detail, the commitment to accuracy, the instinct to document rather than simply observe. Rico's son had inherited his father's gifts, and Chase was determined that this time the Crawford family wouldn't pay for those gifts with everything they had. The Holloway estate materialized from darkness like something out of Southern Gothic imagination, wrought iron gates opening onto a tree-lined drive where Spanish moss created cathedral shadows in the security lights. Lainey pressed her forehead against the SUV's window, watching antebellum architecture emerge from centuries-old oaks, trying to reconcile this gracious beauty with the dangerous world she was entering. Gavin had fallen asleep against her shoulder an hour ago, exhausted by terror and revelation, his sketchbook clutched even in unconsciousness. Chase had traveled in a separate vehicle, giving them space that Lainey appreciated even as it emphasized how completely their circumstances had shifted. She'd called her supervisor from the car, inventing a family emergency that would cover her absence, hating the lies, but understanding their necessity. The nurse who'd covered her shift had sounded concerned but unsuspicious, and Lainey felt the weight of maintaining normalcy while her entire life crumbled and reformed around her. The house itself was revelation, not the cold showpiece she'd expected, but a home that bore traces of generations, rooms filled with antiques and photographs that spoke of history predating Chase's dark reputation. A housekeeper named Martha appeared with the kind of warm efficiency that suggested she'd weathered worse surprises than midnight arrivals of frightened guests. She showed them to connected rooms on the 2nd floor, spaces decorated with understated elegance that made Lainey's modest apartment feel even more threadbare in memory. Gavin woke briefly as Lainey transferred him to the massive 4-poster bed, his eyes unfocused with exhaustion. Is this real? His whispered question could have meant the room, the danger, or the revelations about his father. And Lainey smoothed his hair without answering, because she wasn't sure which reality he needed confirmed. Martha had already unpacked the overnight bags Bishop's team had retrieved from their apartment, displaying organization that felt both comforting and invasive. Sleep eluded Lainey despite bone-deep exhaustion, her mind replaying the evening's events in fractured loops that offered no resolution. She stood at the window overlooking grounds that stretched toward the Savannah River, watching shadows that might have been security patrols or simply darkness moving. Somewhere in this house, Chase Holloway was presumably doing whatever dangerous men did in quiet hours, and Lainey tried not to think about how her son's safety now depended on someone most people feared. Morning arrived with golden light filtering through old glass, distorting the gardens below into impressionist paintings that seemed too peaceful for their circumstances. Gavin explored their rooms with cautious wonder, touching furniture that cost more than their monthly rent, examining books on shelves that held everything from classics to contemporary thrillers. Lainey watched him adapt with the resilience of children who'd learned early that stability was temporary, and something in her chest ached at how easily he accepted displacement. Breakfast was served in a sunroom where plants created jungle atmosphere, and the table could have seated 12, but held settings for 3. Chase appeared freshly showered and dressed in casual clothes that somehow made him more intimidating than the expensive suit had. This version felt personal, real, stripped of the armor that public appearance provided. He greeted Gavin with the same careful respect from the previous night, asking about his sleep and whether the room was comfortable. Lainey studied Chase across coffee that tasted better than anything she'd made in years, watching him interact with her son and seeing layers she hadn't expected. He didn't talk down to Gavin or offer false reassurances, instead treating the boy's questions with seriousness that acknowledged their reality's danger. When Gavin asked if they were prisoners, Chase's answer was unflinching. "You're guests who can't leave yet," which isn't the same but isn't completely different either. The honesty was almost worse than comfortable lies would have been, but Lainey appreciated it anyway. She'd built her life on truth after years of living with the lie of Rico's supposed corruption, and Chase's refusal to sugarcoat their situation felt like respect she hadn't realized she was craving. "How does this work?" Her question encompassed everything: logistics, timeline, the strange domestic arrangement they'd fallen into by necessity rather than choice. Chase set down his coffee with deliberate care, and Lainey recognized the gesture as preparation for difficult truth. "I have people investigating Marchetti's operation, tracking his resources and identifying vulnerabilities we can exploit." The casual mention of exploitation sent shivers down Lainey's spine, reminding her that the man offering hospitality was also capable of violence she probably couldn't imagine. That investigation takes time, requires patience and precision to ensure we don't miss anything that could circle back later. Bishop entered with tablet displaying surveillance footage, evidence that Chase's world continued operating even during breakfast's civilized pause. Lainey caught glimpses of serious men reviewing documents, phone conversations conducted in careful code, the machinery of Chase's organization working problems she'd only contributed to by accepting his protection. Gavin watched everything with artist's attention, absorbing details that would probably appear in future sketches. "Your apartment was visited last night." Chase delivered the news without preamble, nodding toward the tablet where grainy footage showed 2 men picking the lock on Lainey's door with professional efficiency. Her breath caught watching them search her home, rifling through drawers and closets with methodical thoroughness that spoke to training and purpose. They'd found Gavin's other sketchbooks, photographed every page before leaving everything slightly disturbed, a message that they knew where the Crawfords lived and could return whenever convenient. Gavin's hand found Lainey's under the table, his grip tight enough to hurt, and she squeezed back with reassurance she didn't feel. The violation of their space made abstract danger concrete, transformed theoretical threat into men who'd touched their belongings and would have found them if they'd been home. Lainey felt her last resistance to accepting Chase's protection crumble, replaced by cold understanding that refusing his help would have meant she and Gavin were already dead. "We recovered the surveillance equipment they planted." Bishop's addition suggested Chase's people had been monitoring Lainey's apartment, which raised questions about how long they'd been watched and by whom. Chase must have read her expression, because he offered explanation without being asked. "I had your building secured after we left Dominic's, anticipated that Marchetti would move fast to gather intelligence." The casual admission of commanding that level of immediate response emphasized power Lainey had only conceptually understood before. Martha reappeared to clear breakfast dishes, her presence somehow making the conversation about home invasion and surveillance feel almost normal, domesticity coexisting with danger in ways Lainey's brain struggled to reconcile. Chase asked Gavin about school, whether there were assignments that needed attention, revealing that he'd already considered practical details beyond immediate survival. The thoughtfulness surprised Lainey, challenged her assumptions about what men in Chase's position cared about beyond territory and profit. I had your principal notified that Gavin's dealing with a family medical emergency, authorized extended absence without penalty. Chase's words came with paperwork already prepared, documents bearing official signatures that suggested influence reaching into institutions Lainey had thought immune to criminal interference. She should have been horrified by the manipulation, but instead felt grateful that someone was handling logistics her overwhelmed brain couldn't manage. The cognitive dissonance of that gratitude sat uncomfortable in her chest. Gavin's voice was small when he finally spoke, younger than his 8 years. Can I still draw here? The question's simplicity cut through complex adult negotiations about safety and strategy, reminding everyone that this terrified child just wanted permission to do the thing that made him feel safe. Chase's expression softened in ways Lainey suspected few people witnessed. Transformation from dangerous to almost gentle. You can draw whatever you want. Chase stood, gesturing for them to follow as he led them through hallways decorated with art that probably cost more than Lainey's nursing salary for a decade. They arrived at a library that could have existed in a museum, floor-to-ceiling shelves surrounding leather furniture, and windows offering garden views. A large desk sat empty near natural light, and Chase pulled out the chair with invitation clear in the gesture. This room doesn't get enough use anyway. Might as well have an artist in residence. Days folded into each other with strange rhythm that felt both suspended and accelerating. Time marked by meals in the sunroom, and evening walks through gardens where security shadows maintained invisible perimeter. Lainey found herself adapting to luxury she'd never imagined inhabiting. Rooms that smelled of lemon polish and old money, comfort that felt simultaneously welcoming and alien. Gavin bloomed under attention that had nothing to do with pity or judgment, his sketchbooks filling with renderings of the estate's architecture and the wildlife that treated the grounds as sanctuary. The estate's library became Gavin's sanctuary, floor-to-ceiling shelves holding first editions that Chase allowed the boy to handle with careful supervision that suggested trust rather than restriction. Lainey watched her son discover classic literature through leather-bound volumes that smelled of age and privilege, his questions about stories revealing intelligence that mediocre schools had never properly nurtured. Chase would join them some evenings, reading passages aloud with voice that transformed words into living things, and Lainey recognized these moments as gifts that transcended simple hospitality. She'd catch herself memorizing details, the way lamplight softened Chase's severe features, how Gavin's laughter filled spaces that probably hadn't heard children's joy in decades, the sensation of belonging somewhere that should have felt foreign, but instead felt inevitable. Martha's presence provided buffer that made the domestic arrangement feel less charged, her motherly fussing over Gavin creating normalcy in abnormal circumstances. The housekeeper would appear with snacks precisely when energy flagged, suggest activities that kept the boy engaged without demanding adult supervision, and somehow always know when Lainey needed space to process the emotional whiplash of their situation. Through careful observation, Lainey learned that Martha had raised 3 sons of her own, all of whom had chosen paths far from their mother's employer, and the older woman's protective affection for Chase suggested complicated history of watching him navigate impossible choices. One afternoon, Martha confided that she'd never seen Chase allow anyone into his private spaces the way he'd opened his home to them, admission that carried weight of witnessing transformation she hadn't thought possible. The gardens revealed themselves in layers as Lainey explored during Gavin's art sessions, hidden courtyards with fountains that whispered secrets, rose gardens maintained with obsessive care, pathways that led to river views where dolphins sometimes surfaced. She discovered that Chase had preserved much of the landscape exactly as his grandmother had designed it decades earlier, maintaining beauty in defiance of his father's preference for intimidating formality. Walking these paths felt like exploring Chase's psyche through botanical metaphor, seeing evidence of the man he'd tried to be despite inheritance that demanded brutality. Lainey found herself sitting on stone benches his grandmother had probably occupied, wondering what that woman would think of the nurse and her son finding refuge in spaces designed for contemplation and peace. Bishop's security briefings became regular intrusions into their temporary paradise, reminders that the threat wasn't theoretical despite the estate's insulated tranquility. Lainey would see Chase's expression harden during these updates, watch him transform from the patient man teaching her son chess into the calculating strategist who'd survived in a world that rewarded ruthlessness. The duality was stark and unsettling, forcing her to confront that both versions were equally authentic, that Chase contained multitudes that couldn't be simplified into hero or villain. She understood intellectually that his protection required capability for violence she preferred not imagining, but emotionally struggled to reconcile the gentle hands that steadied Gavin's pencil with ones that could authorize actions, Bishop's careful euphemisms barely disguised. The cognitive dissonance was exhausting, pushing Lainey to question every assumption she'd built her moral framework upon, while recognizing that judgment without understanding was its own kind of violence. Chase appeared at irregular intervals, his presence transforming the house's energy in ways Lainey was increasingly aware of despite trying not to be. He'd sit with Gavin in the library, offering quiet commentary on the boy's work, without hovering or demanding gratitude. Lainey watched these interactions from doorways, seeing her son respond to masculine attention he'd been denied his entire life, and felt complicated emotions she wasn't ready to examine closely. The third evening, Chase found Lainey on the veranda where ceiling fans pushed humid air and cicadas created symphony that drowned easier conversation. He carried 2 glasses of bourbon without asking if she wanted company, settling into the chair beside hers with comfort that suggested this was ritual rather than intrusion. Lainey accepted the drink, because refusing felt more awkward than accepting, and the first sip burned throat already tight with questions she didn't know how to ask. "You don't have to stay out here avoiding me." Chase's observation was gentle, but direct, acknowledging the elephant that had been growing since they'd arrived. Lainey had been keeping careful distance, interacting during meals, but retreating to her room or the gardens whenever possible, maintaining boundaries that felt increasingly artificial. She turned to find him watching her with expression that managed to be both intense and undemanding, and something in her chest tightened uncomfortably. "I'm not avoiding you." The lie sounded unconvincing even to her own ears, and Chase's slight smile suggested he heard it too. Lainey tried again, aiming for honesty. "I don't know how to be here, how to accept this without feeling like I'm betraying every principle I've tried to teach Gavin." The admission cost something, revealing vulnerability to someone whose opinion shouldn't matter, but increasingly did. Chase was quiet long enough that Lainey thought maybe she'd offended him, crossed some line she hadn't known existed. When he finally spoke, his voice carried weight of confession rather than defense. "I've spent 10 years trying to be different from my father, building something that operates with strategy instead of brutality." He gestured toward the house, the grounds, the invisible empire beyond. "But different doesn't mean good, and I'm not going to pretend that what I do is defensible by standards you've lived your life following." The honesty was devastating in its simplicity, and Lainey found herself leaning forward, despite instincts that whispered danger. Then why do it? Her question wasn't judgment, but genuine curiosity about choices that had led this complicated man to power most people fled from. Chase studied his bourbon like it held answers, amber liquid catching fading light in ways that seemed almost hypnotic. "Because someone's going to control Savannah's underworld, and I'd rather it be someone who doesn't enjoy the violence, who sees it as necessary evil rather than recreational activity." Chase's pragmatism was chilling and somehow reassuring simultaneously. "My father used to say power was about making people fear you. I've learned it's about making them understand that cooperation costs less than resistance." Lainey absorbed this philosophy that explained so much about how Chase operated. The careful respect he showed Gavin, the way his security team functioned with discipline instead of aggression, even the elegant brutality of how he'd handled their protection. That's still manipulation. Her words lacked accusation, stating fact rather than making judgment, and Chase nodded acceptance. "It is. But manipulation that leaves people alive and functioning feels preferable to my father's approach, which left bodies and trauma everywhere he went." Chase finally met her eyes, and Lainey saw something haunted beneath the calculated control. "I'm not asking you to approve, Lainey. I'm just trying to explain that the man protecting your son isn't the monster the newspapers make me out to be, even if I'm not exactly hero material either." The use of her first name sent unexpected warmth through Lainey's chest, intimate in ways that formal address hadn't been. She realized they'd crossed some threshold without her noticing, moved from captor and captive to something more complicated that didn't have easy definition. "Gavin thinks you're a hero." The observation emerged before Lainey could consider wisdom of voicing it, and Chase's expression flickered with something that looked almost like pain. Gavin's 8 and doesn't understand yet that the world isn't divided into heroes and villains. Chase's response was gentle, almost sad, and Lainey heard the subtext about innocence he was trying to preserve, while knowing it couldn't last. Give him a few years and better perspective, and he'll recognize that I'm just someone who made different choices than his father did. Choices that led to longer life, but dirtier conscience. Silence settled between them, comfortable despite the heavy conversation, and Lainey found herself noticing details she'd been avoiding. The way Chase's hands moved with unconscious grace, the silver threading his dark hair despite his relative youth, the scar visible on his collarbone where his shirt collar gaped. How old were you when Rico saved you? The question emerged from curiosity that had been building since Chase first mentioned her husband's sacrifice. 17. Chase's answer was immediate, suggesting this was memory he'd revisited often. My father had sent me to a meeting I wasn't ready for, testing whether I had what it took to inherit his empire. Bitterness colored his tone, and Lainey heard years of complicated relationship compressed into those few words. The officers setting me up thought eliminating me would weaken my father's organization, create chaos they could exploit. They didn't account for Rico's conscience being stronger than his cover. Lainey imagined 17-year-old Chase facing death orchestrated by people who should have protected him, and felt unwelcome sympathy for the boy who'd grown into this dangerous man. Did you want the empire? Her question touched something personal, and she saw Chase's surprise that she'd asked it. Most people probably assumed his path had been chosen eagerly, ambition driving him toward power rather than circumstance forcing his hand. I wanted to leave, actually. Had plans to disappear after high school, start over somewhere my last name meant nothing. Chase's laugh was bitter, self-mocking. Then Rico died saving me, and my father made it clear that the debt I owed required staying, learning, eventually taking over when his heart finally gave out. The trap of obligation was clear in his voice, and Lainey recognized the cage built from someone else's sacrifice. You could have still left. Lainey knew she was pushing into territory that might close Chase down, but something drove her to understand the choices that had shaped him. Chase turned to face her fully, and the intensity in his gaze made her breath catch despite herself. Could I? With Rico's death on my conscience, knowing that if I ran, his sacrifice meant nothing? The raw emotion in his question demolished Lainey's remaining assumptions about the man beside her. The moment stretched between them, heavy with recognition of shared burden. They'd both been trapped by Rico's choices, shaped by his death in ways that determined their paths forward. Lainey felt the defensive walls she'd maintained crumbling, replaced by understanding that was far more dangerous than simple fear or resentment. Chase represented everything she'd taught herself to avoid, but the man behind the reputation was far more complicated than her categories allowed. Morning found Lainey in the kitchen before dawn, her nurse's schedule too ingrained to break despite having no shift to report to. Martha was already there, moving through preparation with practiced efficiency, and the two women fell into easy rhythm that felt almost normal. Lainey learned that Martha had worked for the Holloway family for 30 years, had watched Chase grow from angry teenager into the controlled man he'd become, and her fierce loyalty suggested depth to her employer that public reputation didn't capture. Chase appeared as coffee finished brewing, drawn by the same early morning impulses that had ruled his life long before circumstances had transformed his household. He looked startled finding Lainey at the counter, as though he'd forgotten guests disrupted his usual solitude, but recovered quickly with small smile that transformed his normally severe features. They stood in kitchen dawnlight, passing cups and sharing space with surprising comfort for people whose lives had collided through violence. Gavin's still asleep? Chase's question acknowledged the absence of the child who'd become their common ground, and Lainey nodded affirmation while wondering when this man had started mattering enough that his inquiries felt personal, rather than polite. She'd caught herself noticing Chase more over recent days, the way he moved through his home with unconscious grace, how his voice gentled when speaking to her son, the intelligence that sharpened his eyes when Bishop brought updates. They migrated to the sunroom by unspoken agreement, watching gardens emerge from darkness as the city woke beyond estate walls. Chase's tablet chimed with incoming messages, business that never truly paused, but he silenced it without checking, giving Lainey attention that felt deliberate. Tell me about nursing. The request surprised her. Personal interest from someone whose world seemed entirely focused on strategy and survival. Lainey found herself describing her work, the ER chaos, the satisfaction of helping people through their worst moments, the exhaustion that came from caring too much in a system designed to extract maximum labor for minimum compensation. Chase listened with focus that suggested genuine interest rather than polite tolerance, asking questions that revealed he'd thought about healthcare systems more than most people in his position. His insights about institutional dysfunction were sharp, informed by perspective that came from operating outside legal structures. "You're good at it." Yeah. Chase's observation wasn't question, but statement. Certainty born from watching how she'd handled Gavin's fear and adapted to their circumstances. Lainey felt warmth at the recognition, validation from unexpected source. "You have the kind of calm competence that probably saves lives regularly, the ability to function when chaos would paralyze most people." The compliment settled warm in Lainey's chest, and she recognized the danger of accepting praise from someone she was trying not to see as more than temporary protector. "It's just training." Her deflection was automatic. Years of downplaying her own capabilities, because claiming them felt like boasting. Chase's expression suggested he saw through the dodge, but respected her need for emotional distance. Gavin's questions about his father intensified, as the photograph Chase had provided found permanent place on the boy's nightstand. Rico's face no longer symbol of shame, but prompt for curiosity about the man who'd shaped him through absence. Lainey found herself sharing memories she'd buried under protective silence. How Rico had wanted to name their son after his grandfather, the ridiculous dance he'd invented to make her laugh during difficult pregnancy, his habit of leaving notes in unexpected places declaring love in handwriting that slanted optimistically right. Chase listened to these stories with attention that suggested he was memorizing details, building portrait of the man whose sacrifice had defined both their trajectories, and Lainey recognized he was honoring Rico by ensuring his son knew him as human rather than martyr. The conversations were painful and healing simultaneously. Excavating grief Lainey had learned to navigate alone while discovering that sharing burden made it lighter rather than overwhelming. The estate's music room revealed itself during afternoon exploration, grand piano dominating space lined with instruments that ranged from classical to contemporary. Lainey discovered Chase played when she heard Chopin drifting through hallways one evening, following sound to find him absorbed in nocturne that spoke of melancholy and longing in ways words couldn't capture. He didn't stop when she appeared in the doorway, instead nodding invitation to join him in room that felt sacred despite secular purpose, and Lainey settled into chair that had probably hosted generations of listeners. Watching his hands move across keys with precision that matched how he handled everything else in his life, she understood this was where he processed emotions his world demanded he suppress, translating complexity into music that required no justification or explanation. When the piece ended, silence between them held more truth than conversation could have managed. Acknowledgement that they were both people who'd learned to survive by compartmentalizing pain until it became manageable. The threat assessment Bishop delivered midweek suggested Marchetti was becoming increasingly erratic. His organization fracturing under pressure, Chase's investigation had applied to vulnerable points. Lainey overheard enough of the briefing to understand that the endgame was approaching, that decisions were being made about how to neutralize danger permanently in ways that probably violated multiple laws she'd spent her life respecting. She waited until Bishop left before confronting Chase in his study, demanding honesty about what was coming, and whether she needed to prepare Gavin for possibility that their protector might not survive the resolution. Chase's answer was characteristically direct. He'd handled worse threats than Marchetti with better planning, but guarantees were impossible in business where miscalculation meant death. The pragmatism should have terrified her, instead sparked anger that he was so cavalier about risking life that had become important to people beyond himself, and their argument escalated into territory neither had intended to enter. "You don't get to do this." Lainey's accusation was sharp, frustration boiling over into words that couldn't be retrieved. "You don't get to make Gavin care about you. Make me—" She stopped before finishing the sentence, unwilling to voice feelings that felt too raw and new to expose. Chase stood from his desk with expression that suggested he was done maintaining careful distance, crossing to her with intent that made her breath catch even through anger. "Make you what?" His question demanded honesty she was terrified to offer, but his proximity and the intensity in his gaze stripped away defenses she'd maintained. "Make me imagine futures where you exist beyond the crisis that threw us together, where Gavin has the father figure he's never had, where I don't have to face everything alone anymore." The confession emerged as accusation, all her fear and longing tangled into admission that changed everything between them by making the unspoken explicit and undeniable. Bishop's arrival shattered the moment's intimacy, and Lainey felt relief mixed with disappointment at the interruption. The security chief brought news that Marchetti's organization was showing signs of pressure, sloppy surveillance, increased communication that suggested desperation, movements that indicated the failed bombing had destabilized his operations. Chase absorbed the information with satisfaction that never quite reached his eyes, and Laney recognized the calculation of someone preparing to strike. How much longer? Laney's question applied to everything. Their confinement, the threat, this strange suspended existence where she was learning to see Chase as human rather than monster. Chase exchanged glances with Bishop, some silent communication passing between them before he turned back to Laney with expression that mixed hope and caution. Days, maybe a week. Chase's timeline was shorter than Laney had expected, and part of her felt relief at approaching resolution. Another part, smaller, more dangerous, felt something that might have been regret at the thought of leaving this estate and returning to the life that waited beyond its protected boundaries. Marchetti's making mistakes, getting reckless, which means he'll create an opening we can exploit to end this permanently. The casual mention of ending threats permanently sent chill through Laney, despite summer heat already building outside. She'd been existing in bubble where danger felt theoretical, buffered by Chase's security and the estate's peaceful beauty. But Bishop's updates reminded her that violence was always waiting just beyond the garden walls. What happens to us after? The question encompassed more than immediate safety, touching on everything Chase's revelations about Rico had upended. Chase's hesitation before answering told Laney the question had layers he was still working through himself. You go home, back to your life, and I make sure Marchetti's people understand that touching you would be a catastrophically expensive decision. His words painted picture of protection extending beyond their current arrangement, and Laney tried to ignore how that promise made her feel. The evidence Gavin provided gets used to clear Rico's name officially, full restoration of his reputation with the department. The offering was everything Laney had wanted for 15 years, justice she'd stopped believing was possible, and Chase was presenting it like simple logistics, rather than life-altering gift. Why? Her voice came out smaller than intended, overwhelmed by generosity from someone who owed them nothing beyond immediate protection. Why go to that trouble when you could just ensure Marchetti backs off and call it even? Chase's answer was long in coming, and when it arrived, carried weight of truth he probably rarely voiced. Because Rico Crawford died saving someone he believed could be better than the world he was born into, and I've spent 15 years trying to prove that faith wasn't completely misplaced. His eyes held Laney's, and she saw vulnerability beneath the control. The young man still trying to honor a dead cop's sacrifice. Clearing his name is the least I can do to balance scales that will never actually even. Gavin's appearance broke the tension, the boy trailing his sketchbook and looking sleepy but happy in ways that made Laney's chest ache. He gravitated immediately to Chase, showing him drawings from the previous day with pride that suggested he'd found the father figure she'd tried to provide alone. Chase examined each sketch with genuine interest, pointing out improvements and asking questions that encouraged Gavin to explain his artistic choices. Watching them together, Laney felt something shift in her perception. Walls she'd maintained crumbling under weight of recognition that Chase Holloway was dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with his criminal empire. He was dangerous because he made her want things she'd trained herself not to need. Partnership, protection that didn't come with resentment, masculine presence that complemented rather than competed with her strength. The realization should have terrified her, but instead settled warm and inevitable as summer rain. Martha called them to breakfast, and they moved as strange family unit that shouldn't have worked, but somehow did, navigating morning rituals that felt almost normal, despite the armed guards patrolling the perimeter. Laney caught Chase watching her across the table, his expression unguarded for just a moment, and saw her own complicated feelings reflected back. They were trapped together by circumstances neither had chosen, but something real was growing in the spaces between necessity and choice. The day stretched ahead with promise and threat balanced on knife's edge, Marchetti growing desperate, Chase preparing whatever move would end the danger permanently, and Laney trying not to think about what happened when the crisis that brought them together finally resolved. She'd survived by not wanting things she couldn't have, but Chase was making that discipline increasingly difficult to maintain. The fourth night brought thunderstorms that turned the river silver and made the old house groan with atmospheric pressure changes. Laney stood at her bedroom window watching lightning illuminate gardens transformed into something wild and primordial, unable to sleep despite exhaustion that went bone deep. A soft knock interrupted her storm watching, and she opened the door to find Chase holding 2 mugs of tea with expression that suggested his own insomnia. Martha swears chamomile helps. Chase's offering came without expectation, and Lainey accepted, because refusing felt churlish, and because she was starting to crave these quiet moments when his guard dropped. They sat in the hallway's window seat, storm sounds creating privacy from the sleeping house, and Lainey noticed how Chase's usual tension eased slightly in the darkness. Neither spoke for long minutes, comfortable with silence in ways that felt remarkable given how recently they'd been strangers. "Gavin asked me today if you were going to be his new father." Chase's words landed with careful weight, and Lainey's breath caught at the implications her son had apparently voiced openly. She felt heat rise in her cheeks, embarrassment mixing with something more complicated that she wasn't ready to name. Chase continued before she could formulate response. "I told him that wasn't how things worked, that families were more complex than replacement parts." Lainey appreciated the gentle deflection, even as she wondered what Chase actually thought about the question. He's never had a father figure who stuck around long enough to matter. Her admission revealed more than intended about their isolated life, the string of her mother's boyfriends who'd treated Gavin like inconvenience, her own deliberate choice to avoid relationships that might disappoint her son again. "I should have expected he'd get attached to the first man who treats him like he's worth attention." "He is worth attention." Chase's response was immediate, fierce in ways that made Lainey's heart skip. "Gavin's remarkable. The way his mind works, his courage, the fact that he sees beauty worth documenting even when he's terrified." There was admiration in Chase's voice that went beyond polite assessment, genuine recognition of her son's specific gifts. Any man who couldn't see that wasn't worth having around anyway. The validation settled warm in Lainey's chest, and she found herself studying Chase's profile in lightning flash illumination. "You're good with him in ways I didn't expect." Her observation acknowledged the disconnect between Chase's reputation and the reality of how he treated her son with patience she'd rarely witnessed from anyone. Chase's slight smile suggested he heard the surprise beneath her words and wasn't offended by it. The estate's sprawling grounds included stable that housed 3 horses. Chase admitted he rarely rode anymore, legacy of childhood passion that adult responsibilities had crowded out. Gavin discovered them during morning exploration, returning breathless with excitement about the mare who'd nuzzled his hand seeking treats, and Chase arranged riding lessons with instructor who'd taught him decades earlier. Lainey watched her son learn to post and canter with fearless enthusiasm that made her simultaneously proud and terrified, understanding that Chase was giving Gavin experiences that would have remained forever inaccessible in their previous life. The transformation in her son was remarkable, confidence replacing the hunched defensive posture he'd developed from years of being judged for his father's supposed crimes, joy replacing the careful guardedness that had made him seem older than his 8 years. Chase would join them at the paddock some afternoons, offering quiet corrections that Gavin accepted with eagerness to pleas that revealed how desperately he'd needed masculine approval, untainted by pity or lowered expectations. The investigation into Marchetti's network revealed connections that made Chase's expression darken in ways that suggested personal recognition. Corrupt officials who'd enabled the rivals' operations were some of the same officers who'd orchestrated Rico's character assassination 15 years earlier. The realization created strange symmetry that none of them could ignore, suggestion that clearing Rico's name and neutralizing current threat were more intertwined than coincidence could explain. Chase spent hours in his study reviewing old case files he'd somehow acquired, building timeline that connected past corruption to present danger, and Lainey understood he was constructing justice that legal system had failed to deliver. She found herself complicit in this extra-legal investigation, offering insights from Rico's personal effects she'd kept boxed in their apartment's storage, notes her husband had made about suspicions he'd never lived to pursue. Together they assembled narrative of systemic rot that had cost Rico his life and nearly claimed Chase's, pattern of violence protecting power that demanded answer beyond simple prosecution. Martha's daughter visited one afternoon, bringing grandchildren who transformed the estate into chaos of childish energy that revealed how empty the house usually was. Lainey watched Chase interact with the 4-year-old twins with awkward gentleness, man who commanded empire reduced to helpless confusion by toddlers demanding he participate in imaginary tea party. The sight was endearing and heartbreaking, glimpse of the father he might have been if circumstances had been different, if his inheritance hadn't demanded he remain unencumbered by vulnerabilities like family. Gavin joined the tea party with seriousness that made the adults smile, translating toddler requests into language Chase could comprehend, and Lainey felt her heart crack open, watching her son bridge worlds with empathy beyond his years. That evening, After Martha's family departed and quiet reclaimed the house, Chase admitted he'd deliberately avoided situations involving children because witnessing innocence he was tasked with protecting through methods that corrupted his own had become unbearable, but Gavin had somehow made that contradiction feel less insurmountable. The storm night kiss remained unaddressed in daylight hours, existing as charged possibility that neither of them knew how to navigate, while Gavin's presence demanded they maintain appropriate boundaries. But awareness thrummed constant between them, hands brushing during dinner, reaching for same serving dish, eyes meeting across rooms with understanding that went beyond words, the magnetic pull that made separation feel like fighting natural law. Lainey caught herself anticipating Chase's arrivals home from whatever business kept him absent during days, listening for his voice and footsteps with a tension she recognized as dangerous, but couldn't quite suppress. She was falling for him despite every rational argument against it, tumbling into relationship that made no practical sense but felt more real than anything she'd experienced since Rico's death. The guilt of that realization kept her awake some nights, wondering if she was betraying her husband's memory by caring for the man he'd died protecting, questioning whether her judgment was compromised by gratitude and isolation, making her vulnerable to first person who'd shown genuine interest. But then she'd remember Chase's careful patience with Gavin, his unflinching honesty about his own limitations, the way he looked at her like she was remarkable rather than merely convenient, and the guilt would recede beneath recognition that Rico would have wanted her to find happiness, rather than remain frozen in grief. Kids respond to honesty better than adults do. Chase's philosophy revealed something about how he approached the world, the calculation that governed his interactions. Gavin knows I'm not his father and never will be, but he also knows I respect him enough to tell him truth even when lies would be easier. The storm punctuated his words with thunder that rattled window panes, and Lainey felt the metaphor wasn't lost on either of them. What happens when we leave? Lainey's question encompassed more than logistics, touching on the connections forming despite every rational reason they shouldn't. Chase turned to face her fully, and the intensity in his gaze made her breath catch despite the storm's drama providing distraction. I've been asking myself the same thing. His admission surprised her with its vulnerability, suggesting he'd been wrestling with questions that mirrored her own complicated feelings. I don't have good answers. Chase's honesty was almost worse than comfortable deflection would have been, forcing Lainey to confront the reality that whatever was developing between them had no clear path forward. My world isn't safe for people I care about, which is why I've avoided caring about anyone for most of my adult life. The confession revealed loneliness Lainey recognized from her own carefully constructed isolation. Two people who'd chosen solitude as protection, discovering it was also prison. Lainey's voice was barely audible over rain hammering the roof. What changed? She knew the answer even as she asked, could feel the shift that had occurred over days of shared meals and quiet conversations, the way protection had evolved into something neither of them had intended. Chase's hand moved toward hers on the window seat, stopping just short of contact in question she could accept or refuse. Her fingers closed the distance, and the simple touch carried weight of acknowledgement that they'd crossed invisible threshold into territory neither could navigate safely. Chase's thumb traced patterns on her palm, gentle exploration that somehow felt more intimate than anything Lainey had experienced in years. This is complicated. Her words were understatement, and Chase's quiet laugh acknowledged the absurdity of their situation. Complicated doesn't begin to cover it. Chase's agreement came with resignation, and something that might have been hope, the recognition that sometimes the most dangerous choices were the ones that felt most right. Thunder crashed close enough to shake the foundation, and Lainey wondered if the universe was offering commentary on their terrible timing. But I'm finding it increasingly difficult to pretend I'm not grateful Gavin saved my life for reasons beyond simple survival. The admission hung between them, unvarnished truth that demanded response Lainey wasn't sure she could give. She'd spent 15 years protecting her heart and her son from disappointment, building walls that kept them safe, but also kept them isolated. Chase represented everything those walls were designed to prevent: danger, uncertainty, the possibility of losing someone else to violence or choices she couldn't control. Yet looking at him in stormlight, she felt those carefully constructed defenses crumbling. I'm scared. Lainey's confession emerged before she could reconsider its wisdom. Vulnerability she rarely showed anyone, making her voice shake. Scared that Gavin's already too attached. Scared that I'm starting to see you as more than just protection. Scared that when this is over, we'll go back to our apartment, and I'll spend the rest of my life wondering what might have happened if circumstances had been different. Chase squeezed her hand gently, acknowledgement of fears he clearly shared. I'm terrified that keeping you safe means letting you go, that the best thing I can do for you and Gavin is ensure you never have reason to see me again after Marchetti's handled. His words painted picture of sacrifice that mirrored Rico's in ways neither of them mentioned, and Lainey recognized the pattern of Holloway men believing distance equaled protection. But I'm also selfish enough to hope there's a third option I haven't thought of yet. The possibility of that third option, something between complete separation and dangerous entanglement, hovered unspoken between them. Lainey leaned slightly closer, testing boundaries and finding Chase meeting her halfway with careful precision. Their kiss was tentative, exploratory, carrying question marks about whether this was grief-fueled mistake or something real enough to survive complexity. When they separated, both were breathing unevenly, storm sounds mixing with their own internal tempests. We should probably think about this more carefully. Chase's words contradicted the way his hand cupped her face, thumb brushing her cheekbone with tenderness that demolished any pretense of casual interest. Lainey nodded agreement, even as she leaned into his touch, rational thought losing ground to emotion she'd suppressed for too long. They stayed suspended in that moment, neither willing to push forward nor capable of pulling back, the storm outside matching the one building between them. Morning would bring complications they'd have to address, questions about what this meant and whether acting on attraction was spectacularly foolish given their circumstances. But for now, in darkness broken only by lightning and the awareness that time was running out on their forced proximity, Lainey let herself have this, the simple human connection she'd denied herself for years, offered by the most complicated man she'd ever met. Bishop's urgent summons came 3 days later, pulling Chase from breakfast where he'd been teaching Gavin chess with patience that made Lainey's heart ache. The security chief's expression carried news that transformed the morning's domestic peace into sharp reminder of why they were really here. Marchetti had made his anticipated mistake, moving resources in pattern that exposed his entire operations structure to people who'd been waiting for exactly this opening. Chase excused himself with apology to Gavin and glanced toward Lainey that conveyed both reassurance and warning. She watched him shift into the version of himself that ran an empire, shoulders straightening with authority that reminded her who he was, beyond the man who'd kissed her during thunderstorms. The transformation was complete and slightly terrifying, stripping away the gentleness she'd been seeing to reveal the steel beneath. The house filled with controlled urgency as Chase's organization mobilized, men arriving for meetings conducted behind closed doors with security that suggested the information being discussed was explosive. Lainey kept Gavin occupied in the library, but she felt the tension radiating through walls, the sense that events were reaching climax that would determine whether they were finally safe or if protection had only delayed inevitable violence. Chase found them as afternoon sun slanted through library windows, his expression carefully neutral in ways that made Lainey's stomach clench. "It's done." 2 words that carried weight of resolution, and Lainey searched his face for signs of what done actually meant. Chase crouched to Gavin's level with the respect he'd shown from the beginning. "The men who wanted to hurt us can't anymore. You and your mom are safe now." Gavin's response was immediate, throwing small arms around Chase's neck with trust that made Lainey's eyes burn. "Thank you for protecting us." The boy's gratitude was pure, uncomplicated by adult understanding of what protection had probably required, and Chase held him briefly before gently extracting himself. His eyes met Lainey's over her son's head, and she saw the shadow there, the cost of ensuring their safety in ways she probably didn't want detailed. "Marchetti?" Lainey's single word asked everything, whether he was dead, arrested, neutralized through methods that would let Chase sleep at night. Chase's answer was carefully constructed to give information without graphic detail. In federal custody along with most of his organization, facing charges that ensure he'll never be anyone's problem again. The passive construction hid Chase's role in orchestrating that custody, but Lainey heard the unspoken mechanics beneath. Federal agents had apparently been investigating Marchetti for months, building cases that needed just one more piece to become prosecutable. Chase had provided that piece. Evidence gathered through means Lainey suspected weren't entirely legal, but were effective enough that authorities had accepted the gift. Gavin's sketches of the men planting explosives had been particularly valuable, artist's detail providing identifications that led to confessions that toppled Marchetti's entire network. "So we can go home?" Gavin's question held complicated mixture of relief and disappointment, and Lainey recognized her own ambivalence reflected in her son's voice. They'd been here barely 2 weeks, but the estate had become temporary sanctuary that felt more like home than their apartment ever had. Chase's expression suggested he heard the reluctance too, and something flickered across his features before control reasserted itself. "You can go home." Chase confirmed what they'd known was always temporary, the arrangement that had only ever been about survival rather than permanence. But I'd like to discuss something first if you're willing. His attention shifted to Lainey with intensity that made her pulse quicken, and she nodded permission for conversation she suspected would complicate everything further. Martha took Gavin to the kitchen for cookies that were clearly strategic distraction, leaving Chase and Lainey alone in library that had witnessed her son's artistic explosion over recent days. Chase moved to the window, his back to her initially as though he needed distance to voice what came next. I've arranged for Rico's full reinstatement to the department's honor roll, complete exoneration with pension payments backdated to your family. The announcement was delivered matter-of-factly, but Lainey heard the significance beneath casual tone. The financial implications alone were staggering. 15 years of pension payments would transform their economic reality, eliminate the paycheck-to-paycheck existence that had defined Lainey's adult life. But more than money, it was justice finally served. Rico's name cleared publicly, in ways that would reshape how Gavin understood his father's legacy. How? Lainey's voice cracked on the single syllable, overwhelmed by gift that exceeded anything she'd imagined possible. I provided evidence that department corruption went deeper than anyone publicly acknowledged, tied it to current investigations in ways that made restoring Rico's reputation politically necessary. Chase's explanation was clinical, hiding the effort that revelation had probably required. There'll be a ceremony next month, posthumous Medal of Valor, full restoration of his record. Gavin will be able to grow up knowing his father died a hero. Tears Lainey had been holding at bay broke free, 15 years of grief and anger and vindication flooding through carefully maintained control. Chase turned from the window, closing distance between them with careful steps that gave her space to refuse comfort if she needed to. Instead, Lainey found herself in his arms, accepting embrace that felt simultaneously foreign and desperately needed, crying against his shoulder while he held her with surprising gentleness. "Thank you." The words felt inadequate for what Chase had given them, but Lainey had nothing else to offer that could match the magnitude of having her husband's honor restored. Chase's hand stroked her hair with tenderness that contradicted everything his reputation suggested about his capacity for softness. Rico deserved better than he got, and so did you and Gavin. When Lainey finally pulled back, Chase's expression held question that had been building since the storm night kiss they'd both been carefully not mentioning. "There's something else I need to say, and I need you to hear it without feeling obligated by everything I've done for you." His preface made Lainey's breath catch, anticipation and anxiety mixing in her chest as she nodded for him to continue. "I don't want you to leave." Chase's admission was raw, unguarded in ways she suspected he rarely allowed himself to be. "I know that's selfish. Know that my world is dangerous and complicated, and probably the last thing you need after finally getting your life stable again. But these 2 weeks have been—" He paused, searching for words to capture something neither of them had expected. "They've reminded me that there's more to existence than just surviving, that connection matters even when it's inconvenient." Lainey's heart hammered against her ribs, torn between wanting what Chase was offering and terror of what accepting would mean. "I don't know how to make this work." Her honesty matched his, acknowledging attraction that couldn't be denied alongside practical obstacles that couldn't be ignored. "Your life, my life, they don't fit together in ways that protect Gavin or give him the stability he needs. Then we figure out how to make them fit." Chase's response was simple, determined, the same focus he probably applied to impossible business problems. "I'm not asking you to join my organization or pretend you approve of what I do. I'm asking if you're willing to see if there's a way for us to build something real despite all the reasons we shouldn't." His hands cupped her face with care that made Lainey's remaining resistance crumble, and she recognized the moment of choice that would determine everything that followed. The weeks that followed Marchetti's arrest brought unexpected complications, as Lainey navigated returning to work while maintaining connection to Chase's world that had become surprisingly essential. Her hospital colleagues noticed changes they couldn't quite name, the way she carried herself with newfound confidence, the expensive but understated jewelry that appeared on her wrist, the fact that she no longer looked perpetually exhausted from financial stress and single-parent overwhelm. Lainey deflected questions with vague references to resolved family matters, unwilling to explain that the resolution involved falling for George's most notorious figure while he systematically dismantled threats and restored her dead husband's honor. She found herself living double life that felt both dishonest and necessary, compartmentalizing the nurse who saved lives through medicine from the woman who'd accepted protection from someone who'd probably ended lives to ensure her safety. The cognitive dissonance was exhausting, But Chase's patient understanding when she needed space to process helped her navigate contradictions that had no clean resolution, his willingness to let her set pace and boundaries making the impossible situation feel almost manageable. The ceremony was held on a crystalline October morning, when Savannah's humidity had finally broken, and the city felt almost comfortable. Lainey stood in the front row of the police department's memorial garden, Gavin beside her in a suit that Chase had insisted on buying despite her protests about accepting more gifts. Her son looked older somehow, standing straighter, as the commissioner detailed Rico Crawford's heroism in ways that finally matched the truth she'd always known, but couldn't prove. Chase stood at the back, deliberately separate from the family section, maintaining distance that acknowledged this moment belonged to Rico's memory, rather than whatever relationship was developing between them. But Lainey felt his presence like gravitational pull, awareness that had only intensified over the weeks since Marchetti's arrest when they'd been navigating what came next. They'd agreed to take things slowly, to let Gavin adjust to changes rather than rushing into arrangements that might destabilize him further. The medal being posthumously awarded gleamed in autumn sunlight as the commissioner pressed it into Gavin's hands with words about legacy and sacrifice that made the boy's eyes shine with tears. Lainey's own vision blurred, watching her son accept recognition that should have come 15 years earlier, justice finally served even if it couldn't bring Rico back. Other officers approached afterward, men who'd worked with Rico and had believed in his integrity despite official narrative, offering condolences and apologies that came far too late, but mattered anyway. Martha had organized a reception at the estate afterward, and Lainey had stopped arguing about whether it was appropriate to celebrate at Chase's home. The truth was, their lives were already intertwined in ways that made separation feel artificial. Gavin had art lessons twice weekly with an instructor Chase had hired. Lainey had accepted position at a hospital where Chase's foundation was major donor, and most evenings found them sharing dinner either at the estate or Lainey's apartment that had been upgraded with security that Chase insisted was non-negotiable. The gathering that afternoon was a strange hybrid of celebration and remembrance, with officers mingling awkwardly alongside Chase's associates in garden that had witnessed Gavin's artistic awakening. Lainey watched her son show his sketches to Rico's former partner, explaining techniques with confidence that hadn't existed 2 months ago, and felt gratitude for unexpected ways. Trauma had transformed into growth. Chase materialized beside her with wine and expression that suggested he was as uncomfortable with social gathering as she was. He would have been proud. Chase's observation about Rico felt important coming from the man her husband had died protecting, validation that carried weight beyond polite condolence. Lainey leaned slightly into Chase's warmth, public acknowledgement of their relationship that still felt new enough to be thrilling. Proud of Gavin. Proud of you. Proud that his sacrifice mattered beyond the moment. His arm settled around her waist with natural ease that suggested their careful navigation was working despite complications. Bishop approached with news that several of Marchetti's former territories had been successfully absorbed into Chase's organization, expansion accomplished without violence through strategy that emphasized cooperation over conquest. Lainey heard the subtext. Chase was consolidating power in ways that made Savannah safer, even while operating outside legal structures. The contradiction still made her uncomfortable, but she was learning that moral absolutes rarely survived contact with messy reality. Gavin appeared with sketchbook, showing them drawing he'd done of the memorial ceremony that captured emotion as well as visual detail. Chase studied it with genuine appreciation, pointing out composition choices that revealed sophisticated understanding for someone so young. Your dad had the same gift for seeing what mattered. Chase's comparison made Gavin beam, connection to father he'd never known providing anchor he'd desperately needed. Are you going to marry my mom? Gavin's question was delivered with child's directness that made both adults freeze, and Lainey felt heat rise in her cheeks at her son's complete lack of social filter. Chase recovered first, crouching to Gavin's eye level with seriousness that acknowledged the question deserved real answer rather than deflection. That's something your mom and I need to figure out together, and it'll take time because it's complicated. Chase's response was honest without being dismissive, treating Gavin's concern with respect while maintaining appropriate boundaries. But I can tell you that I care about both of you very much, and I'm not going anywhere unless your mom decides she wants me to. The promise was directed at Gavin, but meant for Lainey too, and she felt emotion tighten her throat at commitment being offered, despite all the reasons it was impractical. Gavin seemed satisfied with the answer, returning to show his sketches to other guests with energy that suggested the weight he'd carried about his father's supposed corruption had finally lifted. Lainey and Chase stood together, watching the party unfold. Strange collection of people from incompatible worlds, finding common ground in celebration of one boy's courage and his father's sacrifice. "This is surreal." Lainey's observation made Chase laugh quietly, and she felt the rumble through his chest where she leaned against him. "Most of my life is surreal." Chase's response encompassed everything: the violence he managed, the power he wielded, the fact that he was standing in his garden surrounded by cops who probably suspected what he was, but couldn't prove anything. But this particular version of surreal is better than most alternatives I've experienced. His honesty about finding happiness in unexpected circumstances matched Lainey's own slowly forming acceptance that sometimes the right choice didn't look like what you'd imagined. Weeks became months as they built relationship that defied easy categorization. Chase maintained his empire with efficiency that kept violence mostly theoretical. Lainey continued nursing while gradually accepting that her partner's resources could ease struggles she'd normalized. Gavin thrived with stability he'd never had, splitting time between apartment and estate, an arrangement that felt increasingly like actual family rather than protective custody with benefits. Christmas brought first real test when Lainey's sister visited and had to be told simplified version of how they'd met. Explanation that elided bombs and criminal organizations in favor of vague story about Chase helping during emergency. The lies sat uncomfortable on Lainey's tongue. Reminder that Chase's world would always require careful navigation of truth. But watching him help Gavin build model airplane on Christmas morning, patient with mistakes and generous with praise, she recognized that the man mattered more than the mythology surrounding him. Rico's photograph held place of honor in their home now, displayed alongside Gavin's sketch of the memorial ceremony, dual reminder of sacrifice and redemption that had brought them all together. Lainey sometimes caught Chase studying the image with expression she couldn't quite read, and she wondered if he was measuring himself against the man who'd believed he could be better than his inheritance suggested. She hoped he recognized that he'd already proven Rico's faith justified, that the family he'd protected was also healing wounds he'd carried. Spring arrived with azaleas blooming across Savannah, and decision that Lainey had been avoiding finally demanding resolution. Chase had asked again about marriage, more seriously this time, offering partnership that acknowledged her need for independence, while promising support she'd never had. Gavin campaigned enthusiastically for acceptance, his lobbying efforts including carefully documented pros and cons list that showed Chase's influence on his analytical thinking. Lainey said yes on evening when sunset turned the river gold, and the future felt possible despite unlikely circumstances. The wedding was small, held in the estate's garden, where Gavin had first found refuge and grown into himself. Officers who'd worked with Rico attended alongside Chase's organization, strange coalition united by respect for second chances and belief that love found in darkness was worth celebrating. Bishop stood as Chase's best man, and Lainey's sister managed to get through ceremony without asking too many questions about the armed security. Gavin served as ring-bearer with solemnity that suggested he understood the significance of promises being made. Standing before gathered witnesses, Lainey felt the weight of unlikely journey from that first night, when her terrified son had saved a dangerous man's life. She'd expected protection, received that and so much more. Justice for Rico, stability for Gavin, partnership that challenged her assumptions about what was possible when you stopped letting fear make all your decisions. Chase's vows acknowledged complexity honestly, promising not perfection, but commitment to building life together despite obstacles. She offered the same, accepting that love didn't require moral simplicity, only mutual respect and willingness to keep choosing each other. The reception stretched into evening, music and laughter filling gardens that had witnessed their evolution from strangers to family. Gavin showed off his latest sketches, a series depicting their story from that first desperate warning to this moment of celebration, visual narrative of how courage could reshape everything. Chase and Lainey danced while their son watched with satisfaction, suggesting he felt personally responsible for orchestrating their happiness, and neither corrected him because in ways that mattered, he was. Thank you all for following this story. If you've enjoyed it, please write in the comments from which place you're watching this story, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share the video. Your support means everything and helps me continue bringing these stories to you.